Full terms, right? So it initializes the memory to store values and transport across requests, across components. Understood? It initializes the memory to store values so that they can be transported across requests, across requests. So now what happens on ng do check? What happens on ng do check? What happens on ng do check? So what happens on ng do check? Yeah, it is called after that. What happens on do check? That is the point we need to understand. What happens on ng do check? Yes, Anil. If you want to tell something, you can speak, right?
Detect the custom events.
Yes, good, right? So it defines, identifies the custom events and executes the custom events. That means it is responsible
Yes.
also for transporting data between components, right? Yes. Transporting data between components, right? Custom events, those are happened, custom events. Now, ng after content init, ng after content init. In this phase, what happens? So it loads the content into component view. Understood? UI. Am I right? It loads the content into the UI, component views. It binds the content into dynamic angular components, huh? Right. Right. Actually, now, if anyone asks, what is change detection? Change detection. What is change detection? What is change detection? What is change detection? Change detection is, in simple terms, if anyone asks what is change detection, you can simply say that change detection is nothing but ng on changes. Understood? Ng on changes. That means assigning value to property, binding the property to DOM element, identifying the changes in the value, and update the changes back to the value, back to the property. This entire process is called change detection. Understood? So what happens in ng on changes? What happens in ng on changes is called change detection. What happens in ng on changes is called change detection, right? Yeah. Now, that's so updating. Yes, that is vice versa, two-way binding. The property is binded to the DOM means that is any change happened in the property is updated to the DOM, and any change in the DOM is updated back to the property. That is two-way binding. Right? Identifying the changes and updating and reverting back, that is all called change detection. All right. So two-way binding, all this comes under this change detection concept only, right? That is called change detection. Right. So after understanding these few points, so that means we did discuss, these are very important. You need to remember this because 100 to 100% in majority of Angular interviews for experienced people, lot of questions are asked relative to this. So that is the reason we need to concentrate little more on understanding all these, right? Those technical terms important, you need to remember them. Technical terms are very important, you need to remember them. So simple changes is an object which identifies the changes. That I will show you, practically we will see that. ng on changes manages the property and event binding. ng on init, it will initialize the memory. And do check, so what it will do is, it will define the custom events, transporting data between components, right? Input and output, and rendering the content to HTML dynamic, that is done by using ng after content init. ng after content init. So after this, we have another event, ng after content checked. ng after content checked. ng after content checked is actually called, it is called after ng after content init. It is called after this particular method. So it is also called after ng do check. It is also called after ng do check. That means after custom events also it is called. Actually, so it is responsible for content projection. It is responsible for content projection. It is responsible for content projection. Content projection. So actually, content projection is nothing but, it is a way to import content, you can say HTML content. Import HTML content into component template. So you can say HTML content from outside the component, and insert into component template at specified location. This is called content projection. That means importing the content, any HTML content from outside the component and insert into the component at specified location. So it actually executes after binding data to view. That means you can simply say that it brings the content from external component or child component and renders so into the current component. That is actually general meaning component. Actually, if you remembered, we already done that. So content projection is nothing but already your component is having some HTML content, but we are designing some extra content, a separate content, HTML content, and we are rendering into the component depending on the situation. If one situation matches, we will render one content. Another situation matches, we will render another content. We will bring the content from outside source and we will include into the current component. That is called content projection. So we already saw this content projection concept. If you remembered, we discussed that in a topic called view child. Remember that pointer? So we have used this in a view child concept. That is called content projection, view child. We have discussed that in a view child concept. I hope everyone remembered. Where we used view child, remembered? Do you remember that? Where we used view child? Where we used view child? Where we used this view child? Remember that point? What do you say? Remember that view child concept? Huh? Where we used view child? Tell me. Where we used this view child, where we learnt about view child. No, we haven't used any view child in parent to child concept. If you remembered, we learnt about the concept of view child while dealing with ng if, if and then block. Am I right? Remembered? We learnt about rendering an external then block. We discussed about how to use multiple then blocks. Remember that pointer? So if can contain multiple then blocks. So every then block contains some HTML content to render. Every then block contains some HTML content to render. And we will decide which HTML content to render and which location it should render, in which situation it should render. We decide all these points. Am I right? Remember that pointer? Right? I hope everyone remembered that point. So that means, so we use some external component, means external content. We design some external content. So after designing that external content, we inject that external content into our content at specific location. This is called as a content projection. This is called content projection. You will generally, majority of times, you will hear about change detection, but very few times you will hear about content projection. So, but this is technically very important for an experienced person because majority of people know only change detection, and that is regularly asked in interviews at a certain level, up to certain level. But when you are showing vast experience, some more technical terms may come, like content projection, which you will not find in general anywhere in tutorials or somewhere. You will not find very much about content projection. But in real world, we use this content projection regularly. So real world developers have an idea on this term. And to test your experience levels, they may ask what is content projection, right? But you will not find this regularly in the tutorials of Angular anywhere. So when you are looking for the component cycle and all, but it is important. So to understand the technical term, because it is generally used by our developers to tell that we are bringing the content from external source and we are rendering that into the current location, HTML content, not any data. We are not bringing any data. So we are bringing HTML content from another location. Now don't think that bringing data from some other location and injecting the data into the component. So that is data binding. So content projection is related to presentation, only view rendering. It is related to presentation. It is only related to HTML. Okay, na? Right. So this is generally happens after, content checked. After content checked, right? So after the HTML content is rendered, then the content from external source will come and render. That's what happens in this stage. Next stage, after content projection happened, we have ng after view init. We have ng after view init. So it is called after ng after content checked. That means after content checked. That means it is called after the content projection. So it is called after the content projection. Now what happens here is, so generally it will fire up after the initialization of memory for component views and child views. That means this method will fire up after the initialization of memory for component views and child views. That means the memory is the allocated for the component views and child views. After the memory allocated, this method will fire up. So what this method will do is it responds to view changes. That means it identifies the changes. It identifies the changes in parent or child view. It identifies the changes in parent or child view and updates the content. So any change is updated here, and it manages input. So it is also responsible for, it manages input. It manages input of data from parent to child and output from child to parent. That is all managed by using after view init. That means it is responsible for tracking the changes in data and transporting the changes to update between parent and child. That means you can simply say that it is responsible for tracking of changes in data. Is there any change occurred in the data? And transporting the changes to update. So between parent and child, between parent to child, parent and child. So vice versa, parent to child, child to parent. That means what happens on view init, after view init. after view init, actually this will fire up. This will fire up after the content projection happened. It will identify the changes in the parent and child views. It will identify the changes in parent and child views. And any change in the view is updated back. That means, so the data from the parent to child and the child to parent is transported and updated into the views. So the data from parent will come to child and updated into the child view. The data from child goes to the parent and updates into the parent view. So updating the data between parent and child views, it is managed by using this event. It is managed by using this event. After the changes are finished, the final data component, the final content to the parent will be rendered in a event called ng after view checked. Ng after view checked. Ng after view checked. It is called after. It is called after ng after view init. After this method, it is called. So it renders the final content to the parent and child views. So it renders the final content into parent and child views. That means after identifying the changes, after updating the changes, the final content will be rendered into the view. That means this is the view that is final with all the data manipulations and interactions. So that is the final view that is rendered into the UI. That means now in this view, now this is the view which contains all the final result. And further modifications, again the cycle will rotate. Further modifications, the cycle will rotate. But this is the final view rendering. After identifying the changes in parent and child and updating the changes, it will finally render the content and it makes it permanent. So after that, now comes, so ng on destroy. Ng on destroy. This ng on destroy, so it is responsible for clean up the memory. So allocated for component, clean up the memory allocated for component. So before destroying the component, before removing the component from the memory, first it will clean up the memory. It will unsubscribe. It will unsubscribe the methods. It will unsubscribe to methods. That means whatever the methods that are created, they will unsubscribe. And whatever events are defined, it will detach the events. The events are disconnected. And it will destroying memory allocated for component. Whatever memory allocated for component. So generally this is required. So it is required. So destroying is required to handle memory leaks. That means you can handle the memory leaks after if you can destroy the content allocated for the memory for the component. So whatever memory allocated for the component, so it is destroyed. This is the final stage that happens. So once it is done, so that means once it is done, that means now the memory allocated for the component is removed and the new memory will be allocated again when any another component is requested. any component is requested. So this is what actually happens. So when you are dealing with the components. So in the background, all these events will fire up. So the component from the beginning to end, it will undergo several phases. So these are component life cycle phases. You may not write them explicitly, but implicitly they are working. Implicitly they are working. They are implicitly working. So you can explicitly write them. You can explicitly write them. So we can explicitly write them. Why to explicitly write them? To define some more additional functionality. That means, for example, so here we have all these events. All these events are by default working in the background. ng, on, init, and all these events are working in the background. So even you don't write, they are working in the background. Then why do we need to write? So why do we need to write is a simple point. For example, suppose every class have a default constructor. Am I right? Every class have a default constructor. That default constructor is doing some functionalities. If a class is already having a default constructor, then why do we write again a constructor? Why do you configure again a constructor? What do you say? If already there is a constructor, then why you are writing a constructor again? We are writing the constructor again. We are writing the constructor again in order to define some additional functionality at the time of initializing memory. Understood? At the time of initializing memory, already it is doing some internal tasks. In addition to those tasks, so we will give some more tasks. In addition to those tasks, we will give some more tasks. So that means, for example, suppose you see, so means general example I am giving here. Suppose we have a class. So class some demo. So or say product. Product is a class. And in that we have a property. So public. So we have a product name. That is the property. And we are creating an object. Let obj is equal to new product. And console.log, we are printing console.log. So obj dot product name. Now what is going to print as an output? Can you tell? What is going to print as output? Can you tell? What will be the output? What will be the output? What do you say? What will be the output for this? What will be the output for this? The output for this usually is undefined. Am I right? It is undefined. Am I right? Right, good. It is undefined. It is undefined. Already we learned, right? If a value is not defined, now who initialized this value to undefined? Understood? We haven't defined as undefined. Then who initialized this to undefined? Who initialized this to undefined? That means internally that task is managed. The task is managed by constructor. Am I right? the task is managed by constructor. Am I right? That means constructor is going to initialize the property value as undefined if the value is not defined. If any empty value is there, it will simply set it as undefined. It will simply set it as undefined. So we can write a constructor. We can write a constructor. And in the constructor, we can access this product name, and we can initialize this to some other value. Understood? Even if you are not defining this, internally the constructor will fire up, and that will take this value and keep it as undefined. Understood? That means by default it is working. Then why you are writing again? So we want to define some additional functionality. Explicitly we want to define some additional functionality. In that case, we write again to handle that functionality. So this is technically why we need these lifecycle hooks externally, explicitly to define. Explicitly why we need to define them, how we can configure them. That means these events are already there. So then why you are writing these events? So we are writing these events in order to define some additional functionality. That is what the point is. So all these hook methods will execute for every component. For every component, these hook methods will be implicitly working. So let me give an overview. What are those hook methods? Component cycle starts with ng on changes. On ng on changes, it gets the values, assigns to property, binds the properties to DOM, identifies the changes in the value, updates back. After that, the memory required for storing the values and transporting the values across components is initialized by ng on init. After initializing the memory, if any value need to be transported from one component to another component, then that is done by using do check. It will use custom events to collect the data from one component, from another component, and to transport data to another component. And after that, the initial content will be rendered into HTML. After rendering initial content to HTML, any external content is to be rendered into HTML that is identified according to the situation, and it is rendered into the component existing HTML at specific location using a content projection technique. And after the content projection, so it identifies the changes in the views, UI changes. That means any component is adding, any component is removing, it identifies the changes in the views. After identifying the changes into the views, it will render the final content into the UI. Updates the changes if any changes need to be updated, and tracking the changes and identifying the changes. And content projection is nothing but bringing the content, HTML content, from external source and rendering into our HTML. Understood? Into our component. Already we done that. So already we done that when we learned about the view child option. I hope that example is already there here, right? So conditions example, we discussed about that. So when we learned about this parent and child components, I think if then demo, yeah. Yeah, here we have learnt that concept actually, if you remember that. That means what we have done in this, is, so you can see, so we created external template of view. One is details, another one is preview. Understood? And these templates are rendered. These templates are rendered into, so the HTML, you see, these templates are rendered into HTML, according to the situation, by using if then block. We can use multiple then blocks. I showed you that we can use multiple then blocks. Currently, then block is rendering only this content. If you want several other contents, then those contents we can access. From external source. By using view child, we can access the content, and we can render that content. So render that content into the existing content at specific location. This is called as content projection, right? Content projection means we are bringing a template from any another source, and we are rendering that into this location, into the current location, depending on the condition and the situation. So this is the content projection. View child is under the concept of content projection. We discussed about that in content projection, right? So, and finally, destroying. After final content is rendered, it is destroyed. Whatever the memory allocated, whatever the memory initialized, it is destroyed. Destroyed. It is required to handle the memory leaks. These are all the phases of the component cycle. Now, in these, some points we already discussed, but we will write them practically, and we will see some example on this, how to handle them, right? So up to this, is everyone clear in understanding these life cycle methods? Everyone clear about this? You have any doubt? Already we created now. So you cannot create multiple components, right? You can create a batch program for components, right? So anyone have doubts related to this? Anyone have doubts related to this? Is everything clear? What do you say? Everything clear? Anyone have any doubts related to this? Everyone is clear about this? So because this is an important concept, and if you are clear with this, then we can practically implement some of the component cycle events, and we can see practically how to handle them, right? So everyone clear? No problem, right? Right, no issues. Right. Yeah, good. You can create multiple components at the same time, but you have to write a looping statement in your shell. Understood? You have to write a looping statement into the shell. You cannot directly create multiple components. We have to write a for loop for creating multiple components at the same time in the command. Yeah. You can also use batch commands if you know batch commands. That is not the point here. I hope everyone is clear with all these component lifecycle events. No issues in this, right? Okay. So once we are clear with this, now we will see here the concept. How do we work with these various phases of component? That means we will learn about change detection, how the change detection works. What is change detection? How change detection works? What are the general life cycle hook methods? How to write them? How do we write the hook methods? We will see that. Already we saw content projection. Content projection using view child we already discussed. But when we use this content projection, if you have observed, actually this is implementing on init. It is implementing on init. So we were using a constructor on init. So it is allocating memory for a template. And that in that memory, the template is configured and the template is loaded into the UI. The memory is allocated. We used that ng on init. So when we discussed about this content projection. But one more time, I will show you the change detection and content projection related options, right? We will see one practical example now, understanding the concept change detection. Then you can get a clarity on that, how it works and handles. Then we can go with content projection and work with them, right? That we will see in our next session. So tomorrow we will see that. So once go through all the cycle components, life cycle hooks, and let me know if you have any doubts in this, so that I can start a new session. In the new session, we can start practically working on these events now. Okay, na? Right? Hope you are clear with all this. And if you have any doubts, you can let me know about that, right? Yeah. Then tomorrow we will see practically how to implement this. Right. Yes, Samir.
Hello, sir. Good morning.
Morning.
Sir, we have two component, component 1 and component 2. Suppose in component 1, one button, and when user click on that button, we direct on a component number 2. How? Without output, at the output.
That is routing, na? We can navigate dynamically. Routing, that is, you will learn in routing.
Okay, sir.
That is under routing concept.
Okay, sir. Okay.